Ladies and gentlemen, if you got anything from me, it's to find your thing and do you. Make some noise for what you created. Because we all know it's not what you do, it's how you do. And this is how we do.
Hey everybody, today we're going to talk for just a minute about some essential study skills that I would imagine most of you are using. If you're not, obviously please start. But that's not the intent. It's not to teach you new study skills in this presentation. What we wanted to do is to have an opportunity for you as classmates to share with each other how you're doing these study skills. So I'd invite you to do two things as you watch this presentation. First, if you're not using any one or more of these 7 essential study skills, please start. Whatever you're doing that's working, these will only add to your skill set, to your toolbox of study skills, and allow you to do even better in your studies. Second, if you're already using some of these techniques, look for how your classmates are also using those, but maybe in a slightly different way. It might keep things interesting. It might give you some new ideas of how you can use your current tools in just a slightly different way. At the very end of the presentation, there's a short 3-question survey. I would ask that you would take just a minute and answer each of those 3 questions. Shoot me an email with your answers. They're simply so that we can get an idea of what's most important to you guys. If these types of presentations are helpful, and if so, what kind of information you would like to hear about later. So here are the 7 essential study skills. They are being able to memorize, to identify high-yield material, to conceptualize, to self-check, to teach or learn from someone else, repetition, constant exposure, and then time management. I feel it's important to mention that all of these study skills are important, and there isn't one that's more important than the others. The reality is you're probably using a combination of many of these. Ideally, we would be using all of them all of the time to just maximize our ability to learn the material. Let's go through each one of these and show you some examples of what we're talking about, as well as show some video examples from your classmates of how they are utilizing these skills in their studies. When we talk about memorizing, we're referring to just the basic, foundational, have-to-have-it information. These are terms, vocabulary words, bones, muscles, ligaments, systems, the things that you have to have a general idea of so that you can then use to expand and to work within. There's lots of different ways to memorize material. Everybody's just a little bit different. The more tools you can use to get it sunk into your brain and then be able to recall it later, the better. The faster we can memorize something, the sooner we can then work within that framework of information and get it to the higher levels of thinking and application. Obviously, if we've had the material before in our undergrad studies or are familiar with it, it's going to be easier to memorize. But even if we've never seen it before, we need to get in, we need to memorize the basics so that we can then move on to other skills as fast as possible. Go ahead and pause for just a minute, pull out a piece of paper and something to write with, and let's do a quick activity about 2 different ways that we memorize things. We're going to talk about utilizing our verbal memory versus our visual memory, and see if you prefer one or the other.
You remember information in 2 main ways, as words using your verbal memory or as pictures using your visual memory. They're different mental processes and they achieve dramatically different results. Verbal techniques are things like acronyms and acrostics, word associations and rhymes, and even songs, and they all need a serious chunk of boring repetition. They can be fantastic for a small number of words, but they don't activate the amazing power of your visual memory. People never believe how absolutely crazy the difference is. So here's a challenge for you, and you can prove it for yourself. First, let's test your verbal memory. I'll give you a list of 10 words and let's see how many you're able to remember. Here we go. Piano, elephant, truck, bottle, basketball, chair, pineapple, dog, painting, trampoline. Okay, pause the video and write down all the words you can remember.
So how did you do? Did you get all 10 words? Did you get them in the right order? The average person will remember about 5 to 7 words, and they may or may not be in the correct order.
Now let's test your visual memory. I'll give you another list of words, but this time I'll also give a short story and draw a picture. To activate your visual memory, just create a mental picture of everything I describe and draw. You can even close your eyes if you want and just listen to my voice. Here we go. Ferrari. Imagine you're driving a bright red Ferrari with the top down. The music is pumping above the throaty growl of the engine and your hair is blowing in the wind. Chicken. With a loud thump, a giant chicken lands in the seat next to you. It's the size of a person, enormous and yellow. It must have fallen out of the sky. Watermelon. The chicken opens the car door and leaps out onto the road. As it stands there, an enormous green watermelon rolls over the top of it and keeps rolling down the road. Barack Obama. You watch the watermelon roll down the road and straight into Barack Obama. The watermelon splits in half and Obama is left standing there, dripping in watermelon juice. Poodle. Obama picks up a passing poodle and uses it to wipe juice off his face. The poodle is pure white, but as it soaks up watermelon juice, it slowly turns bright pink. Flagpole. Obama throws the poodle away. It flies through the air and lands on the top of a tall flagpole. The weight of the juicy poodle causes the flagpole to slowly topple over. Cake. With a loud and messy splat, the flagpole falls into the middle of an enormous birthday cake. Icing, cream, and candles go flying everywhere, raining down on people passing by. Doll. A large dollop of cream lands on the head of an oversized Barbie doll. It creates a weird chemical reaction and the doll shoots into the sky like a space rocket, blonde hair trailing behind her. Pizza. The doll rockets upwards and just as it starts to fall, a large pizza explodes open above her head like a parachute. The pizza is attached to the doll by long strings of melted cheese. Giraffe. The pizza eventually lands on the ground, covering the doll, and a giraffe walks over and starts eating the pizza, bending its long neck and stretching its tongue to lick up the delicious cheese. Skateboard. After eating too much pizza, the giraffe pulls out a skateboard, jumps on it, and starts gliding down the street, ducking signs and streetlights as it rolls along. Cigarette. The skateboard begins coughing and it stops and uses one of its wheels to light a cigarette. The cigarette becomes engulfed in flames and the skateboard throws it away. Statue of Liberty. The flaming cigarette flies through the air and lands on the torch being held aloft by the Statue of Liberty. The torch bursts into flames too. Ice cream. The Statue of Liberty comes alive and thrusts the burning torch deep into a big bucket of ice cream. It's cherry chocolate ice cream that melts and starts to bubble ominously. Fireworks. The ice cream explodes into fireworks, lighting up the sky above the Statue of Liberty with brightly coloured fireworks forming the words, "The End." Okay, pause the video again and write down how many words you're able to recall using your visual memory.
So how did you do on this one? You probably noticed that there were many more words on this exercise, 15 to be exact. The average person will get between 10 and 15 correct, as well as get them in the same order using this visual memory technique. Here are a few pictures of how Alexa has used her notes, particularly the bones in this case, to get that information into her long-term memory. She's used drawing, she's used labeling, she's put them on the same surface right next to the actual printed words. Lots of things going on here that could help her get that into her long-term memory. Flashcards are a very common way to quickly memorize information, put it in the memory bank, and then be able to recall it for further use. Brian's going to show us how he uses a program called Anki to create his flashcards.
Hey guys, I just wanted to show you how I make flashcards. I use a program called Anki, A-N-K-I. I think flashcards are a good way to remember the information we're learning. So how I do it is I've got like the whole course MCM here, and I've got each unit. We're in genes and development, so in each unit, so we'll have a test on genes and development, and then I've got each lecture listed out here. After I've watched the lecture, I then go through the PowerPoint slides and I pull these things out that I want to put into a flashcard while I'm reviewing the lecture. So if I want to make a new flashcard, I click the deck I want to make it on, I add a card, and then I've got the lecture open because I'm studying it. So the way I make the flashcard is I come up with my question like, what is an adherence junction? And then you could type it out, but I usually just use the Windows snipping tool, grab a new snip, copy this, and then you can just paste it right on the back of the card. Boom, easy. And that way when you get the question, you can see where it came from and learn some other stuff while you're at it. For each hour of a lecture, we only have like 4 questions. So if you have 40 slides in an hour, pick the most important ones. You don't have to make 60 slides or 60 flashcards. So anyway, that's the way I study, and then I can come back in here and review and study, and it'll pull the card up. That's how I do it. Thanks.
Our next topic is identifying high yield. It doesn't take long to realize that there's way too much stuff to just memorize. You've got to be able to pick and choose what sections you're going to memorize, where you're going to spend your time, and the best way to do that is to identify the high yield material. There are lots of different ways to identify high yield, and some work better for some than others. A couple of things that are not on here are getting to know your professor, looking for cues and signals that they may give about important topics that will be on the test, learning objectives either in a handout, a textbook, at the end of a PowerPoint, are also other ways to identify high yield concepts. I'm going to show you 2 good examples of identifying high yield topics. The first is by Bradley. He's going to show us not only how to identify the high yield topic, but how he uses this skill with a partner to review for a test.
Okay, we're going to get started with a little bit of something that me and my friend like to do right before a test. Is we like to quiz each other on what we think are high yield topics, mostly diseases or how things might go wrong and what it would cause. So in order to do this, we'll just kind of look through our PowerPoints and we'll look for things that we think are high yield, like this, for example, a disease. And so I might ask my friend, okay, a mother brings in her child. She says that the child was crawling recently, but then hasn't been able to recently. And the baby's showing other signs of neurological deterioration. You do a retinal exam and see there's a cherry red spot on the retina. What is the baby likely suffering from and what's causing it? And my friend might say, well, I believe this is a Tay-Sachs. It's a lysosomal storage disease. And it's specifically caused by a buildup of gangliosides in the lysosomes of the neurons, which is causing them to not function correctly. I'll be like, hey, good work. And I might mention just a few things that he didn't in addition. it's higher in Ashkenazi Jews. It's something they might say on a question. And and that one can be similar to eye cell disease. So maybe I'll ask him, what's eye cell disease? How's that different? Or whatever. If my friend doesn't get it right, or if I don't get a question right, then we'll study it more in depth until we have a better understanding of it, and that way we know what we don't know.
Fujiko uses OneNote to gather and organize the different information for certain systems, parts, whatever it might be, topics, so that she can then study the topic all together as a high-yield topic rather than individual components of that topic.
Okay, this is how IDEO. So instead of studying by lecture and just having a piece of information where I just have all of the information that this professor wanted me to know about these various diseases, I have been putting in a page about each disease, and I have a template like this of everything that I would want to know about that disease. So instead of thinking like a student and figuring out what the professor wants me to know, I'm trying to think like a doctor and think about what I would want to know about all these different diseases. Now the bonus is that when I go to Pathoma or Sketchy or anything else, all that information will fit into these categories in my template, and I can just add that information to the information that I got from lecture. So that is what I've been doing. For example, down here I've got aortic regurgitation. This was like the 4th or 5th disease that he talked about, and I'm just putting everything into my template from the lecture. And that is how IDEO. And that way when I am in the exam, instead of having drawers that are all organized the way the professor would organize them, I have drawers that are all organized by disease, the way that I would organize them, and I'll be able to find everything later. I also have separate tabs for diseases, drugs, skills I need to know. These are like exam skills, auscultation, things like that. Tests to do, like INR tests and things like that. And procedures, different procedures, if I've never heard of them, I put them in a different tab. And that's all I've got. Thank you.
Next is self-check. One of the bad habits we probably picked up in our undergrad studies is quizzing or reviewing shortly before the test. Usually it's the day before, the night before, maybe the day of. It just doesn't work in medical school. You guys should be quizzing and self-checking constantly. Every time you read or learn something, just quickly go back over it, ask yourself a question, have a study partner ask you a question, cover up your notes, see if you can draw it yourself, label something, a blank version of it. Always try to stump yourself, because if you can stump yourself now, it's better to do that than on the actual test. Once you start feeling like you know the material, get with a tutor, get with someone else, go through your notes, do something different to try to find out what piece of information is not in your long-term memory bank. Alexa submitted this video, and I think it's a good example of how many of these skill sets can be used simultaneously to maximize our study time. You'll notice that she uses the program OneNote. She draws. She's using it to organize and conceptualize, which we'll get to next. She's constantly using it to self-check, and notice the creative way she's using it to self-check. And then it also provides an easy way for repetition, that repetition is incorporated through each of these different tasks that she's doing.
So normally I study off of the PowerPoint slides, and I just do notes directly on the PowerPoint slides like this, and I do use OneNote. And if I have a problem with that side, usually I'll put like a blue disc up in this corner. I'll just draw it in there. But if it's a slide that's really important where the professor says there's possibly a question about this stuff, I'll put a huge star in the corner just so I know to look over that slide really well. Also, so this is MCM. I've also done this for MSK. And then also with MSK, I found that drawing things out repetitively really helped for me. So I have this whole notebook, basically, of things that I have drawn out repetitively for memorizing the muscles, doing charts, memorizing muscles, like I said, origin, insertion, action, innervation. And to be honest, I would do that all in one color, and the things I got wrong, I would do in a different color. So then when I basically wrote everything out again, I can more easily remember the things that I was likely to get wrong because they were in different colors. Yeah, some of the things, different colors that were wrong. Just kind of moving along. Drawing things out really helped. So there's like a little drawing there. I drew out a lot of the vessels and the nerves, where they went to. I would draw it out and quiz myself and try to fill in the arrows. And then the brachial plexus, which we all know and love. So I did that as well. Chord levels, what they innervate, lateral chord, kind of just naming the trunks and branches and chords and things like that. This is how I studied for radiology. I just went through the slides and drew really sloppily the main points or certain fractures, things like that. You can see, I can't even really read that, osseous Bombart lesion? Questionable, but I knew it at the time. So yeah, just doing things like that, drawing out, repetitive writing after looking over my slides with the notes. I usually use like the same kind of format, so I'll draw this and then I'll usually redraw the same thing like several times just so I have one image that I'm remembering, so it's not too confusing. More repetitive things. Lumbosacral plexus, which is really helpful. And then I also have a similar notebook started like this for MCM, but it's basically just me writing down main points and highlighting things in different colors. Colors really help me as well. Also for MSK, I found that going to the bone lab while knowing all of the bone structures ahead of time really helped me. And I also liked to draw on my buck book, dermatomes, there's one, muscle attachments, nerves and arteries, where they go, highlighting, coloring, labeling again. Yeah, drawing things out, a lot of drawing things out. So yeah, that's how I study. Hope this helps.
Next is to conceptualize the information that we've just memorized. When we refer to conceptualizing the material, there's lots of different variations of how to do that, and they're all correct. It simply means taking the material and working around it, through it, inside it, pulling it out, putting it back in, looking at it from different angles, seeing the bigger picture of it, but then going down to the tiny picture of it. Anything that you can do to tie in concepts. So we use phrases like higher order thinking, concept mapping, following it down through the pathways and seeing what road stops are along the way. The idea is to be able to, almost within your head, go inside that topic or body part or bone or nerve system, whatever it is, and weave your way through it in a way that you can toss the things that you don't need aside, but you know that they're there until you find the exact material that you're looking for. If you think about that on a test, they never give you just give us this simple answer to something you memorize. It's always a case study. It's always a pathway of thinking. You have all this information in your mind. You need to be able to sort through it all and get to the exact topic that they're asking about. Claire uses her notes and different colors to be able to tie these different pieces together. You'll notice that as she goes through a simple page of notes, there's lots of different information that her brain is picking out. She sees a color, she ties it with another color. She sees this and she's tying it with that, and she's able to do it as she reads through her notes.
Hey guys, I just wanted to give you a little tutorial in how I studied, particularly during MCM and IHL. This is also a method that you can use throughout your physiology in the systems courses, and I still use today when I'm trying to review physiology. So I'm a visual and kinesthetic learner, so colors are a good way to help me sort of compartmentalize things. So like as you can see, I compartmentalized different types of proteins and aspects of the cytoskeleton so that they would stand out to me and I could remember them more easily when I think back to them. I would also do clinical correlations or negative effects in bright red, so like catastrophe, a clinical correlation where you have a mutant gene encoding for truncated keratin causing cell rupture and easily blistered skin. Boom, everything's in red. I can see it right there. I would do this for every lecture, and I'd try not to do more than like 4 pages per lecture. Cytoskeleton is 4.5. But I just wanted to make sure that I got everything in there that was important, and I used the learning objectives to guide this. For this, I would buy notebooks that are kind of on the more expensive side on Amazon. They're really sturdy. They have anti-bleed through pages. And I bought these really sweet pens that I highly recommend that also don't bleed through. And they're like the tip is the perfect thinness while still being sturdy and not breaking. I still do this today when I'm reviewing physiology. Like I said, it helps to memorize relationships and important equations and things like that. So I hope this helps. Thanks.
Mackenzie uses a variety of different tools, again, to help her pull all of the information in together and better remember it.
Alright, so this is the video for Mackenzie Sturdivant and how I studied for MSK. I use a combination of my computer, where I watch the lectures from home on MediaSite, normally on ×2 speed. It helps me get through the material and catch what's important to the professor in a timely fashion. And then I take notes on Notability. The way I organize it initially, I started with each of the sections, and I would upload each of the lectures here, where while watching the video I would go through, highlight important things, and write out information that I thought was more pertinent, because writing it as the physician is saying it, it helps me remember it better. So this is a better example. Some notes I took. Once I have all of the notes or all of the lectures watched, I would make a study guide. So study guides for lower limb, there's quite a few of them. It took some time, but once I've made a study guide, I usually didn't have to go back to that information more than 1 or 2 additional times. So for example, for lower limb, I made one study guide for all of the innervation. So I followed the innervation all the way from the top to the bottom, superficial and deep. I used the app Complete Anatomy, and I would make these diagrams myself, and I'd find them on Complete Anatomy, screenshot them, put them on my study guide, and then relabel them again. And I would do that for all of the muscles. I did it for clinical correlation, and I did it for the vasculature. So for example, here's my study guide for the muscles of the lower leg and foot. Also on Complete Anatomy, helping to learn the actions, I would watch the movements that they supply with that app as well. I hope this is helpful, and if you require any additional information, please let me know. Thanks.
In my opinion, this next skill is one of the most important, but also one of the least utilized or utilized effective tools. Many of you are probably thinking, oh, I am not a group studier, I don't like working with other people, and that is totally okay. I'm the exact same way. I hope you'll listen to some of these ideas of why it would be important to do something with someone else, whether that is reviewing, whether that is studying, whether that is quizzing, whether that is teaching. There's a lot of studies that show that this is a powerful way to increase our retention, our memory, and our ability to recall information. Most learning specialists will agree that we remember about 5% of what we hear in a lecture, 10% what we read from a textbook, 20% if we combine the two, think of listening to a lecture and taking notes, and about 30% if there's a demonstration or some kind of object lesson. That's great, but if you're greedy like me, I want to remember much more than just 30% of what I spent my valuable time studying. So notice it jumps to 50% when we start engaging in group discussion, almost 75% if we can then practice what we're discussing and learning, and almost 90% when we actually then teach someone else or use it immediately. The principle behind it is we're opening other pathways in our brains, using other neurons, and the more that we can use, the better. If you think about what it takes in order to teach someone or to be quizzed by someone, you're going to have to go through all of those other steps. You're going to have to see or listen to, or a combination of the two, to learn the material. You're then probably going to have to repeat it. You're going to have to go over it again to the point where you feel that you understand the material. And then the way to prove that is our skill of self-checking, being able to use groups or someone else as an opportunity to find out what you really did know. Sometimes when you're doing this, you will become the teacher. Other times you will become the learner, and you're kind of back to the idea of you're seeing it, you're hearing it, you're maybe writing it out, to the point of if you can teach it to someone else, you probably will be able to recall it very well in an exam type situation. There are lots of people who can help you know what you don't know. They don't have to know the material all that well. They don't have to even be a student. It helps if they do. But simply asking them to quiz you or to show you the flashcards that you just made, and now you can't cheat at the back of the answer. You have to actually answer it, and they have to tell you if it's right or wrong. Anything like that is going to help you be able to self-check better. It's going to help solidify what you're learning. It's just a win-win for everybody. Next, let's talk about repetition. Most of you don't need an explanation of what repetition means, but the principle behind it is that you are viewing and being exposed to the material over and over and over. Not necessarily in the same form. The more you can change it up, the better. But that might be a lecture and then notes and then a lab and then a review session, and then repeating that the next time you study or the next day. Don't let very many hours or days go in between reviewing material. You need to keep it fresh. One example with lectures would be preview it the night before you go to bed. Just take 5 to 10 minutes and look through the slides. Go to the lecture or listen to the lecture the next morning, and then come home or wherever you study and then really dig into that lecture. Once you start digging in, that's already 3 times that you've been exposed to that single lecture. Then maybe you review the lecture a couple days later and once before the test. You've now seen that lecture 5 times.
Here are a couple things that I do a little bit different when I study. I don't take the path of flashcards and writing down a lot of stuff initially, but rather I take a little bit of a different approach. Let me show you what it is that I do. On the slides at first, when I hear the lecture, I'll write down notes at the bottom, as you can see, but then I go back through the lecture and I'll actually highlight or color words that are important or that I'm not familiar with. After I do this, I go back through all the lectures again, and I'll actually make a Word document with definitions and keywords, vocabulary words that I'm not familiar with. And then I'll read back through it and highlight those that I don't feel comfortable with again, so that I can emphasize those and spend time. And I'll do actually the same thing except for diseases and disorders to make sure that I know all of them very well. Once again, you can see the highlighted and bolded words that I felt like were important to memorize.
So my go-to strategy as far as studying is after every day, after lectures, I'll make sure I come home and go over everything that we went over that day and review it to get it down to the best that I can. And so it doesn't matter what time I go to bed that night, I just need to make sure I cover all the material from that day. And then on the weekend or before tests, I'll go over it again so that it's my third or fourth exposure to the material. And it really helps me to get it down doing that.
Alright, guys, this is my study plan. I have 3 to 4 run-throughs of the material. The first time is a brief overview, just like in lecture or at home. The second time, I take a blank sheet of paper and write down every single note I can make from the lecture slides and from the written materials. The third time, I rewatch the lecture and make sure I didn't miss any material. For the fourth and final time, I go through all of my previous notes, make sure I know every single one of those items. If any of those items I struggle with, I write those materials on a separate sheet of paper that I can review before the test.
All right, our last and final skill is going to be time management. Again, some of you are already thinking, really, I need to hear this again. I know how to manage my day. And that's good. What I want to focus on is, are you managing your study time? The time that you've set apart each day to study, do you have a plan for what you're going to do during that study time? It's probably a little overwhelming to look at all the things that you have to balance in a given day. And we hear the phrase all the time, well, there wasn't enough time. I didn't have enough time to do that. The reality is everybody has 24 hours. It's how we choose to use those 24 hours that makes up whether it was a good day or maybe a rush day or not a good day. So again, you're going to need to prioritize. You're going to need to figure out what is most essential to have in your day, and then literally assign each of those things a time that you're going to do them, a length of time that you're going to do them, and when one is done, move on to the next one. Don't cheat. Don't try to give yourself more time because you don't feel that you accomplish everything that you needed to. Trust your schedule, trust your system, that when you come back to it, there will be enough time. And I'll show you what I mean by that. Let's say this line represents a typical day. Doesn't matter what times are in these, you can set your own times and the length of times, but this represents from the time you wake up till the time you go to bed each night. Most people are going to have their morning routine, whether that's exercising, eating, getting dressed, showering, whatever it might be. And then shortly after that, they're going to begin their studies. For a lot of you, that means at 8 o'clock you're coming to school, you're going to lectures. Others, it means I'm studying at home or in the library or somewhere else. It doesn't matter. The idea is you have set apart that time for study time. I would recommend that you don't keep those study times much more than 4 hours. If you look at your typical day, lecture time is usually from 8 to 12, and then there's a break from 12 to 1. After that, labs or other things start up from 1. They go till about 5 o'clock. So your day's naturally broken into 2 4-hour study sessions already. If you take a little dinner break and then study in the evening for a little bit, you'll notice that you now have 3 distinct times, usually about 3 to 4 hours each, that you have set aside to study. That also leaves time before your first study session, after your last study session, and a couple of times in between to eat, to see family, to do whatever it is you do. Use that time for yourself. Don't try to incorporate study into that time. Otherwise, you're missing out on the chance to have a break from your study. And if you bring those other things into your study time, you're missing out on valuable time that you have set aside to study. So compartmentalize them. Give yourself permission to not study when it's personal time and to set personal things aside when it's study time. This usually equates to about 9 to 12 hours of study time each day. This is usually plenty. You hear some people who have a photographic memory and can study 2 or 3 hours a day and they're just fine. They're lucky, but that's rare. And then you also hear some people who study for 15 to 16 hours a day. In my opinion, that's too much. When we talk about engaged study time, meaning you're focused, you're attentive, you're enjoying what you're doing, after 3 to 4 hours of that, your brain is starting to want a break. It needs a rest. It needs to eat. It needs to do something different. So you may be putting in that many hours, but as far as effective study time, I would argue that 9 to 12 hours is about the maximum that a person can get in a typical day for effective study time. Each of the various study sessions can be broken down just a little bit farther, and you should have a plan of what you're going to do for that 3 to 4 hour study time. It might be lectures, it might be listening to lectures, it might be a lab, it might be visiting with a tutor, it might be studying with a group. Again, the idea is to have a plan to go over all of the material that you should be learning at that time, to include self-checking that time, to incorporate all of the different study techniques and skills that we've been talking about, and then to be able to use them in a 4-hour chunk, take a break, use them again, take a break, use them again. As we talk about trying to stay ahead of the curve on top of your studies, keeping up with the lectures, it should allow enough time in a day to be able to go through each item of material, identify what you already know, spend a lot of time on the stuff that you don't know, review it to check if you're learning it the way you do, and have just a routine and a system to be able to get through your studies each day. In this little graphic, each of the separate study times from the overall study section are divided up into 5 equal sections. That very rarely will be the actual case. You're in charge of the time. You get to decide how long to study what. A general recommendation would be to spend the majority of your time in the systems, but also not neglect OPP or ethics classes, the other ones that aren't quite as time intensive, but at the same time you don't want to just put off until the day before an exam and then have a cram session. Sometimes that might be 3 hours and 50 minutes studying your system, spending 5 minutes of review, and then spending 2 or 3 minutes just looking over what's coming up in those other classes. And if nothing's coming up, great, move on, take your lunch, come back and study systems again that afternoon. And as I mentioned before, some of that might be one system, but you're looking at lectures, then you're going to the lab to look at a cadaver, then you're going to the library to look at a model, then you're going to a group to have a group review. Change it up, have some variety, even though it might all be the same subject or same topic. Use a variety of different techniques to help that information gather and collect and then be available for recall later. So Kyle is going to finish up our videos today and share with us some of the things that have helped him over the past few weeks be able to manage his time and get the most out of his study periods.
Hey guys, Kyle here. I just thought I'd make a quick little video kind of talking about some of my study habits and then some of the things that I've done to change, how I've kind of approached some of this stuff and how it's helped me over the first couple months. So just wanted to share that stuff and hopefully it helps somebody out there. Enjoy and thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Hopefully this information has been helpful, that there's one or two things that will be able to apply to you and that you can start using or use just a little bit differently from what you're already doing. If you would take just a minute and send me an email with the answers to these 3 questions, it would be super helpful. Was there something that you learned today that you feel you can use? Second, was this format of a presentation helpful? And if not, what would have been better for you? And third, what are 2 topics that you would like to see in the future if we continue to do these how do you do presentations?